Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're stepping onto a stage where centuries of human ambition, artistry, and athleticism converge. The arena of the Olympic Games. From the dusty fields of ancient Olympia to the roaring stadiums of our modern cities, the Games have carried the dreams of generations, reflecting the ideals, rivalries, and stories that shape our shared history. So if you're ready to unwind, settle in, and let your mind travel from the marble temples of Greece to the dazzling lights of today's opening ceremonies. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll never miss another journey through the timeless landscapes of human history. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Origins in Ancient Greece. The first Olympic festival. The story of the Olympic Games begins in a world that feels both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. Ancient Greece, more than 2,500 years ago. This was a place where myth and history coexisted, where the gods were believed to walk among mortals, and where human excellence was measured not only in wisdom and art, but in the strength of the body and the courage of the spirit. In that world, on a plain in the region of Elis, lay a small sanctuary called Olympia. Today, its ruins are quiet, scattered among olive groves and wildflowers, but in its time, it was a place of great pilgrimage. Olympia was sacred to Zeus, the king of the gods, and it was here, according to legend, that the very first Olympic Games were held. The origins of the Games are wrapped in layers of story. One myth tells that they began as a tribute by the hero Heracles, after he completed his famous labors. In gratitude to Zeus, he built an altar at Olympia and declared a festival of athletic contests to honor the god. Another tale claims the Games were founded to celebrate a truce between rival kings, with athletic competition replacing the bloodshed of war. Whatever the true beginning, one thing is certain. The Games were born from a fusion of religion, politics, and a deeply held belief that physical achievement was a form of glory in itself. The earliest recorded Olympic Games took place in 776 BCE, though they may have been held even earlier. At first, the competition was humble compared to what we might imagine today. In those early years, there was just a single event. The stadium race, a sprint covering roughly 192 meters, the length of the stadium at Olympia. The victor's name was recorded for history, and he would return home as a celebrated hero, his reputation secured for life. But the Games were more than sport. They were a cultural and spiritual gathering unlike any other. The 4-year cycle between Games became known as an Olympiad, and it was used as a way of measuring time itself in the Greek world. City-states across Greece, often locked in bitter rivalry, agreed to a sacred truce during the Games, the Ekacheria, which allowed athletes and spectators to travel safely to Olympia without fear of attack. This truce was not only practical, but symbolic, a reminder that for all their divisions, the Greek people shared a common identity. As the Games grew, so too did the variety of events. Wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, and chariot racing were added, each testing a different kind of strength, skill, or endurance. The pentathlon combined running, long jump, discus, javelin, and wrestling, and winning it was considered one of the greatest honors an athlete could achieve. Chariot racing, held in the hippodrome, was as much a spectacle for the crowd as a contest for the participants, with thundering horses and drivers navigating sharp turns at breakneck speeds. The athletes themselves trained for months in advance, often in dedicated gymnasia, and competition was open only to free Greek men. Women were barred from competing and, in most cases, even from watching the games, though there were rare exceptions. The most famous being Caniska of Sparta, who became the first woman to be recorded as an Olympic victor when her chariot team won in the 4th century BCE. Victory at Olympia was not rewarded with gold or silver, but with something far more symbolic, a simple crown of olive leaves cut from the sacred grove of Zeus. This prize, humble in material value, was immense in prestige. To win at Olympia was to achieve a kind of immortality. Your name would be sung by poets, carved into stone, and remembered for generations. The honor reflected not only on the athlete, but on his city-state, bringing prestige to his homeland. The games were also a stage for Greek culture. Between competitions, poets, philosophers, and historians would share their works, turning Olympia into a festival of the mind as well as the body. It was here that Herodotus is said to have read his histories, and where sculptors like Phidias crafted masterpieces such as the colossal statue of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And always, the religious aspect was central. Before the games began, sacrifices were made at the altar of Zeus, and great processions wound through the sanctuary. The competitions themselves were an offering, a way of honoring the gods through human excellence. In the Greek worldview, to compete was not merely to seek personal glory, but to participate in something sacred, a union of divine favor and human effort. Over time, the games expanded in scale and reputation, drawing competitors from across the Greek-speaking world. The number of events grew, and the athletes became increasingly specialized. The prestige of Olympia was unmatched. Other Pan-Hellenic games existed, such as the Pythian, Isthmian, and Nemean games, but none carried the same weight. To be an Olympic champion was the pinnacle of athletic achievement. Yet, for all their grandeur, the games remained firmly tied to their Greek roots. Even as the political landscape shifted, with city-states rising and falling, the Olympics endured as a shared tradition. They were a reminder that, despite fierce rivalries, there was a cultural unity that bound the Greek people together. A unity expressed not through conquest, but through competition. By the time the classical period of Greece reached its height, the Olympic Games had become a fixture of the Mediterranean world. Athletes trained for years for the chance to compete, and cities invested heavily in supporting their champions. Victors returned home to receive free meals for life, statues in their honor, and the adoration of their fellow citizens. The Games had become more than a festival. They were an institution, a living link between the human and the divine. In the centuries that followed, the Olympics would evolve, facing challenges from political change, foreign conquest, and shifting cultural priorities. But in these early days, beneath the summer sun of the Peloponnese, the foundations were laid for a tradition that would outlast empires. The dusty track of Olympia, the olive crown, the roar of the crowd, all of it spoke to something deep in the human spirit. The desire to test oneself, to strive for excellence, and to be remembered. The first Olympic festival was not the grand spectacle we know today, but it carried within it the seeds of something timeless. In its blend of sport, religion, and cultural unity, it became a mirror of the Greek world, its ideals, its rivalries, its love of beauty and strength. And though the centuries have transformed the games beyond recognition, that ancient spirit still flickers in every competition, every medal, every athlete who stands at the starting line, waiting for the signal to begin. Chapter 2: The Sacred Games of Olympia and Greek City-States. To truly understand the Olympic Games in their ancient form, we have to see them as the Greeks themselves did, not simply as athletic contests, but as sacred events woven into the very fabric of their religious and political life. In the ancient Greek mind, Olympia was more than a sports venue. It was a holy sanctuary, a place where mortals could come closer to the gods, and where the act of competition itself was considered an offering. The site of Olympia sat in a fertile valley where the rivers Alpheos and Cladeos met, surrounded by gentle hills and groves of olive and pine. At its heart stood the Altis, the sacred precinct, enclosed by walls and filled with temples, statues, and altars. The most important of these was the great Temple of Zeus, a massive Doric structure completed in the 5th century BCE. Inside stood the chryselephantine statue of Zeus, designed by the sculptor Phidias, towering nearly 13 meters high and made of ivory and gold. The god sat upon a throne, a figure of serene power, holding in his hand the goddess of victory, Nike. For the ancient Greeks, this statue was more than a work of art. It was a manifestation of divine presence. The games themselves took place in honor of Zeus, and every athlete, official, and spectator who entered Olympia was expected to respect the sanctity of the occasion. Before the competitions began, elaborate religious rituals were held. Athletes swore oaths before the altar of Zeus Horkios, Zeus as guardian of oaths, promising to compete honestly and abide by the rules. Animals were sacrificed, and their smoke curled into the air as a visible link between earth and heaven. But the sacred nature of the games was not confined to Olympia alone. The Ekacheria, or sacred truce, was proclaimed throughout Greece months before the festival. Heralds traveled from city to city, announcing the cessation of hostilities, ensuring that athletes and spectators could travel safely. In a land divided into fiercely independent city-states, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and many more, this was no small matter. The truce represented one of the rare moments when Greek unity was visible, however temporary. Each city-state sent its best athletes, and while the competitions were between individuals, victories were celebrated as civic triumphs. a champion's glory reflected on his polis, bringing honor and prestige. Cities would often provide lifelong rewards to victors. Free meals, front row seats at festivals, and exemptions from certain civic duties. Statues of victorious athletes were sometimes erected in Olympia itself, ensuring their fame would endure not just at home, but for all who visited the sanctuary. The political dimension of the games was always present. Leaders and envoys used the gathering as an opportunity to negotiate alliances, proclaim treaties, or display their city's wealth and culture. It was common for city-states to commission grand dedications, bronze statues, ornate tripods, or even entire buildings, to commemorate victories or demonstrate piety toward Zeus. These displays were subtle acts of diplomacy, reminding rivals and allies alike of a city's strength and influence. The atmosphere at Olympia during the Games would have been electric. Crowds gathered from across the Greek world, from the islands of the Aegean, the coasts of Asia Minor, the colonies of Italy and Sicily and beyond. Merchants set up stalls, selling food, wine and souvenirs. Artists and poets performed their works, hoping to find wealthy patrons. Philosophers engaged in spirited debates beneath the shade of the sacred olive trees. The competitions themselves were intense. The Stadion race remained the centerpiece, but other foot races were added, including the Diaulos, a double Stadion race, and the Dolichos, a long-distance event. Wrestling and boxing tested raw strength and endurance, while pancration, a brutal blend of wrestling and boxing, pushed athletes to the edge of their physical limits. Equestrian events, especially the four-horse chariot race, drew huge crowds, and while the drivers risked life and limb, the official victor was the owner of the team, often a wealthy aristocrat or even a royal. Training for these events was grueling. Athletes lived in dedicated quarters in Elis for a month before the Games, preparing under the supervision of trainers and officials. Diet, exercise, and discipline were strictly enforced. The body was celebrated as a vessel of beauty and power, and athletes competed nude, displaying their physical form in its idealized state. This practice was both practical and symbolic. It eliminated the possibility of concealed weapons or performance aids, and it honored the Greek admiration for the human form. Even in victory, athletes were expected to show humility before the gods. The olive crown was a reminder that triumph was a gift from Zeus, not merely the product of human effort. After the Games, victors often dedicated part of their prize or commissioned statues as offerings of thanks. The stories of legendary champions, such as Milo of Croton, a six-time wrestling victor famed for his extraordinary strength, became part of Greek lore, passed down through generations. The sacredness of the Games was reinforced by the belief that the gods themselves favored Olympia. Myths told of Zeus choosing the site after defeating his father, Cronus, or of heroes competing in divine contests there. The very ground of Olympia was thought to be blessed, its groves and altars set apart from the ordinary world. In this way, the Olympic Games were far more than an athletic festival. They were a living expression of Greek religion, politics, and culture, a place where the competitive spirit, devotion to the gods, and pride in one's homeland converged. In the minds of the Greeks, to stand in Olympia during the Games was to stand at the center of the world, in the presence of both gods and heroes. And as the centuries went on, that sanctity would be tested. Political rivalries would grow sharper, wars would threaten the sacred truce, and the Games themselves would evolve in response to the shifting currents of Greek history. But for now, in their classical prime, they remained a beacon, a reminder that even in a divided land, there could be moments of unity under the watchful gaze of Zeus. Chapter 3. Events, Athletes, and the Glory of Victory. If the sacred atmosphere of Olympia gave the Games their meaning, it was the competitions themselves that brought the sanctuary to life. Events that tested speed, strength, skill, and endurance, drawing cheers and gasps from thousands of spectators. In these contests, the ideals of the Greek world were made tangible. Discipline, courage, and the relentless pursuit of arete, excellence in all things. When the earliest Olympic Games were held in the 8th century BCE, the program was simple. There was only one event, the stadion race, a sprint over a distance of roughly 192 meters, the length of the stadium at Olympia. The winner's name was immortalized as the champion of that Olympiad, and in those days, that was glory enough. But as the Games grew in prominence, so too did the number of events. The athletic program expanded into a diverse and demanding series of contests that reflected both practical skills valued in Greek society and the cultural admiration for the well-trained human body. The foot races remained central. The diaulos, introduced in 724 BCE, doubled the stadion distance, requiring both speed and endurance. The dolichos, a long-distance race that could stretch up to 24 stadia, nearly 5 kilometers, tested stamina and strategy. Runners trained to balance pace with energy conservation, knowing that an early burst of speed could lead to an early collapse. By the 7th century BCE, wrestling, pale, joined the roster. It was a contest of pure grappling, with no striking allowed, in which victory came from throwing an opponent to the ground 3 times. Wrestlers honed not only their strength, but their balance, leverage, and cunning. Boxing, picks, on the other hand, was brutal. Competitors wrapped their fists in leather thongs that left the fingers free but hardened the knuckles. There were no weight classes, no rounds, and no time limits. The fight continued until one man conceded or could no longer stand. Blood and broken bones were common, yet the Greeks admired the courage it took to step into the ring. Perhaps the most feared event was pancration, introduced in 648 BCE. A blend of wrestling and boxing, it allowed almost any technique short of biting and gouging eyes. Competitors could punch, kick, grapple, and choke. The pancratiast was a complete fighter, combining strength, speed, and tactical intelligence. Stories tell of athletes who refused to yield even in death, becoming symbols of heroic endurance. The pentathlon brought together 5 events: the long jump, javelin throw, discus throw, stadion sprint, and wrestling. This combination tested a wide range of abilities: agility, precision, power, and overall fitness. To win the pentathlon was to prove oneself as the most complete athlete of the Games. Beyond the stadium, equestrian events held a special place in Olympic prestige. The Hippodrome, a massive oval track, hosted chariot races that drew huge crowds. Teams of horses thundered around the course, their drivers straining for control through perilous turns. Crashes, known as Tethripon pile-ups, were frequent and often fatal, but victory in the four-horse chariot race was one of the highest honors in the Games. The interesting twist was that the victory belonged not to the driver, but to the owner of the horses, often wealthy aristocrats or even ruling monarchs. Among the athletes, certain names echoed through Greek history. Milo of Croton, a wrestler from the 6th century BCE, was perhaps the most celebrated. His legendary strength was said to be the result of a lifetime of disciplined training and perhaps a flair for dramatic demonstrations. One tale claims he carried a full-grown bull on his shoulders, then killed and ate it in a single day. His victories, 6 Olympic titles in wrestling, cemented his place as the archetype of physical power. Another famed competitor was Leonidas of Rhodes, a runner who dominated both short and middle distance races in the 2nd century BCE. Over 4 consecutive Olympiads, he won 12 individual titles, a record that stood for more than 2,000 years. His endurance and versatility made him the greatest sprinter of the ancient world. To achieve such feats, athletes trained with remarkable dedication. Preparation was year-round, but the final month before the Games was spent in Elise under the supervision of officials. Here, athletes lived and trained together, following strict diets and exercise regimens. They practiced not only physical techniques, but also mental focus, for in the arena, composure could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Victory at Olympia was unlike any other reward in the Greek world. The crown of wild olive leaves, cut from the sacred grove of Zeus, was the sole prize. No money, no material wealth, and yet that wreath was worth more than gold. A champion returned home to public celebration, sometimes entering his city through a breached section of its walls. A symbolic act, as it was said, a city with such a man needed no walls for defense. Poets composed odes in his honor. Sculptors carved his likeness. His name became part of the history of his people. The glory was enduring, but it came with expectations. Champions were held to high moral and civic standards. A victor who disgraced himself could see his name stricken from the records, his statue removed, and his reputation destroyed. The Greeks valued not only the achievement, but the character of their champions, for they believed that athletic excellence was inseparable from virtue. As the centuries passed, the events of Olympia reflected the values and ambitions of Greek society. Athletic skill was not seen as a diversion from the serious business of life, but as an essential part of it. To excel in the Games was to embody the harmony between body and mind, discipline and daring, personal ambition and communal pride. In the dust of the stadium, under the blazing summer sun, every race, throw and grapple was more than a contest. It was a living tribute to the gods, to the city-state, and to the idea that human potential, when pursued with dedication, could approach the divine. And yet, as glorious as the competitions were, they existed within a fragile balance. The same city-states that celebrated unity at Olympia also waged wars against one another. Politics, ambition, and rivalry would increasingly influence the games, shaping their future in ways both inspiring and troubling. In the next chapter, we step beyond the arena and into the larger Greek world to see how the Olympics both reflected and shaped the relationships and rivalries of the city-states that made them possible. Chapter 4: Decline and the End of the Ancient Olympics. For more than 1,000 years, the Olympic Games flourished. Through wars, shifting alliances, and the rise and fall of city-states, they remained one of the most enduring traditions in the Greek world. But no human institution, however sacred, exists in isolation. The games were shaped by the world around them, and as that world changed, so too did the spirit of Olympia. By the 4th century BCE, the political map of Greece was already transforming. Athens and Sparta, once the great rivals of the classical age, had both lost their dominance. The rise of Macedon under Philip II and his son Alexander the Great brought much of Greece under a single ruler for the first time. Alexander's conquests spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean and into Asia, creating a new cosmopolitan Hellenistic world. The Olympics adapted to these changes. Athletes now came not just from the old Greek city-states, but from newly founded cities in Egypt, Persia, and beyond. The Games became a stage for the entire Hellenistic world, and victors hailed from places as distant as Antioch, Cyrene, and Alexandria. Yet, as the geographic scope widened, the unifying sense of Greek identity that had once defined the Olympics began to blur. Wealth began to play an increasingly visible role. In earlier centuries, athletes were often supported by their city-states as a point of civic pride. But by the Hellenistic period, personal sponsorship and patronage became more common. Kings and wealthy nobles funded the training and travel of promising athletes, expecting in return the reflected glory of victory. This shift, while keeping the games well-financed, also eroded the idea of purely amateur competition. Even the events themselves began to change. New competitions were added to appeal to broader audiences, while some traditional events declined in prominence. Professional athletes who made careers out of traveling from one festival to another sometimes participated in multiple events for the sake of increased fame and reward. The Olympic ideal of sport as a sacred offering to the gods remained in name, but the reality was becoming more commercial and political. Still, Olympia retained its religious significance. The sanctuary's temples continued to receive dedications from across the Greek-speaking world. Victors still wore the olive crown, and the sacred truce was still proclaimed before each Games. But the cultural landscape was shifting, and a much larger transformation was on the horizon. In 146 BCE, Greece fell under Roman control. At first, the Romans treated Greek traditions with respect, even admiration. Educated Romans prided themselves on their knowledge of Greek literature, philosophy, and art, And the Olympics benefited from this cultural exchange. Roman athletes began to compete, and wealthy Roman patrons funded repairs and expansions at Olympia. Yet Roman influence brought subtle changes. The Romans favored spectacle. Elaborate public entertainments like gladiatorial games and chariot races in massive arenas. While the Olympic events retained their original forms, the atmosphere of the Games began to blend with the Roman taste for grandeur and showmanship. The religious dimension, so central in earlier centuries, gradually became less prominent, particularly as Roman religious practices mixed with Greek ones. The slow decline of the ancient Olympics was not caused by a single event, but by the accumulation of many factors. The shift from local pride to imperial politics, the rise of professional athletes, and the erosion of the sacred framework that had once set Olympia apart. The most decisive blow came not from political change, but from religious transformation. In the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire underwent a profound shift when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. Over the following decades, Christianity moved from being a persecuted faith to the official religion of the empire. For Christians, the Olympic Games, with their pagan rituals, sacrifices, and dedication to Zeus, were relics of an old religion. While some admired the athletic feats, the religious underpinnings were seen as incompatible with Christian belief. Pagan temples across the empire were closed, and festivals dedicated to the old gods were increasingly discouraged or banned. The end came under the reign of Theodosius I. In 393 CE, he issued an edict banning all pagan festivals, including the Olympics. The sanctuary at Olympia was abandoned, and over time, earthquakes, floods, and neglect reduced its once grand temples and stadium to ruins. The statue of Zeus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was removed to Constantinople, where it was later destroyed in a fire. For nearly 12 centuries, the Olympic Games had been a constant, a thread linking generations, a bridge between city-states, and a celebration of human potential. With their disappearance, a chapter of ancient history closed. The stadium fell silent, the sacred grove grew wild, and the name of Olympia faded into the realm of memory and myth. Yet the spirit of the Games did not vanish entirely. Stories of the great champions and their feats were preserved in the writings of historians and poets. The ruins of Olympia, buried under centuries of earth, waited patiently for rediscovery. And though no one in the 5th century could have imagined it, the idea of a global gathering of athletes inspired by the ancient model would one day rise again, not in a Greek sanctuary, but in a modern world, very different from the one that first gave the Olympics life. In the next chapter, we will step forward more than 1,000 years to the 19th century, when the Games would be reborn, transformed into an event that aimed to unite not just the Greek world, but the entire planet. Chapter 5: The Vision of Pierre de Coubertin and the Olympic Revival. For more than a millennium, the stadium at Olympia lay in silence. The roar of the crowd, the pounding of feet on the track, the chariots thundering around the hippodrome, all of it had vanished into history. The sacred grove of Zeus became overgrown, the temples collapsed into ruins and the world moved on. The very idea of the Olympic Games seemed destined to remain only in the pages of ancient writers and the fragments of statues unearthed from the earth. But in the late 19th century, at a time when the Industrial Revolution was reshaping the modern world, one man dared to imagine that the ancient festival could be reborn. His name was Pierre de Coubertin, a French educator, historian, and visionary whose dream was not simply to recreate the Olympics, but to use them as a bridge between nations. Coubertin was born in 1863 in Paris into a noble family. From an early age, he was fascinated by history, particularly the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. But his passion extended beyond books. He was deeply concerned about the physical and moral education of young people. In France, he saw a system that emphasized academics but neglected physical training. Coubertin believed this imbalance stifled both personal development and national vitality. His interest in sports was partly inspired by a visit to England, where he observed the emphasis placed on athletics in elite schools such as rugby. There, sports were not seen as mere leisure, but as a means of building character, discipline, and teamwork. Coubertin became convinced that such principles could be applied on an international scale, and that reviving the Olympic Games could be the ideal vehicle for this vision. In Coubertin's mind, the new Olympics would be more than an athletic competition. They would be a peaceful meeting ground for the youth of the world, a place where friendly rivalry could replace military conflict, and where the shared pursuit of excellence could transcend political and cultural boundaries. The important thing, he would later write, is not to win, but to take part. But the idea of resurrecting an event that had been dead for over 1,000 years was not easy to sell. Many saw it as a romantic fantasy, something fit for history books, but not for the modern age. Others doubted that such an undertaking could be organized on an international scale. Undeterred, Coubertin began to build support. He reached out to scholars, athletes, and sports organizations across Europe and beyond, gathering allies who shared his belief in the unifying power of sport. His efforts culminated in a historic meeting in Paris in June 1894. The International Congress on Physical Education. Representatives from 12 countries attended, and over several days, they debated and refined Coubertin's proposal. On June 23rd, the Assembly voted unanimously to revive the Olympic Games, with the first modern edition to be held in Athens in 1896. This was no accident. Athens was chosen not only for its historical connection, but as a symbolic bridge between the ancient and the modern. Coubertin envisioned the new games as open to all nations, with events modeled on both ancient and contemporary sports. The competitions would be held every 4 years, just as in antiquity, but with no religious dimension. The focus would be on international friendship, athletic excellence, and mutual respect. In preparation for the revival, Athens underwent significant transformation. The Panathenaic Stadium, an ancient venue originally built in the 4th century BCE, was reconstructed in gleaming white marble. Greek pride in hosting the first modern games was immense. For many, it was not just a sporting event, but a reaffirmation of their link to the glories of antiquity. When the Games opened on April 6, 1896, the atmosphere was electric. More than 60,000 spectators filled the stadium, cheering athletes from 13 nations who had come to compete in 43 events. There were foot races reminiscent of the ancient stadion, but also modern additions such as gymnastics, swimming, and cycling. The first champion of the modern Olympics was an American, James Connolly, who won the triple jump. But the most celebrated hero of the Games was a Greek, Spiridon Louis, a humble water carrier who won the marathon, an event inspired by the legendary run of Pheidippides from Marathon to Athens in 490 BCE. Louis's victory brought the stadium to a frenzy, and he became a national icon overnight. For Coubertin, the success of the 1896 Games was a vindication of his vision. The event had captured the world's imagination and proved that the spirit of Olympia could be reborn. In the years that followed, the Olympics would grow in size, complexity, and influence, sometimes straying from Coubertin's ideals, yet always returning to the central idea that had driven their revival, that sport could be a force for peace and understanding. The new Games were not a perfect mirror of the old, nor were they meant to be. They were a reinvention, shaped by modern values and technologies, yet rooted in an ancient tradition that had once united the Greek world. Coubertin had succeeded in turning a dream into reality, and in doing so, he had given the world not just a sporting event, but a shared ritual for the modern age. In the next chapter, we'll follow the early decades of the modern Olympics, the triumphs, the challenges, and the evolving nature of an event that was beginning to capture the hearts of nations across the globe. Chapter 6. The First Modern Olympics, Athens, 1896. The spring air in Athens carried with it both the warmth of the Mediterranean sun and the weight of history. On April 6, 1896, for the first time in more than 1,000 years, the word Olympiad was not a relic from ancient texts. It was alive again. The Panathenaic Stadium, gleaming in white marble, curved like an ancient amphitheatre beneath the Athenian sky, ready to welcome a gathering unlike anything the modern world had yet seen. Nearly 60,000 spectators filled the stands, their excitement rippling through the city like an electric current. Flags from 13 nations fluttered in the breeze. Athletes in simple uniforms, many representing their countries for the first time in such a setting, stood ready to compete. The past and present seemed to blur. Marble seats from antiquity now held the modern citizen, and events once run on dusty Greek tracks would now unfold on a global stage. The Games opened with the sound of trumpets and the arrival of King George I of Greece, who declared them underway. The program spanned 10 days, featuring 43 events in 9 sports: athletics, cycling, fencing, gymnastics, shooting, swimming, tennis, weightlifting, and wrestling. While some disciplines, such as running and wrestling, echoed the ancient competitions, others reflected the modern world's tastes and technologies. Athletics drew the largest crowds, The stadium-style sprint, the discus throw, and the long jump were all reminders of the ancient Greek program, though now performed with modern training and equipment. James Connolly of the United States claimed the first Olympic title of the modern era in the triple jump, an achievement that made headlines far beyond Athens. But the defining moment of the 1896 Games came with the marathon, an event inspired by the legend of Phidippides, who, in 490 BCE, is said to have run from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens to announce the Greek victory over Persia. On race day, 17 runners lined up for the 40-kilometer course. Among them was Spiridon Louis, a humble water carrier from the village of Marousi. Louis ran steadily, conserving his energy as foreign competitors set a punishing pace early on. As the race wore on, the heat and the distance took their toll. One by one, the front runners faltered. When Louis entered the stadium in the lead, the crowd erupted in a roar that shook the marble stands. He crossed the finish line in 2 hours, 58 minutes, and 50 seconds, and in that instant became a national hero. The king's sons ran to congratulate him, and the people of Athens lifted him onto their shoulders. His victory was more than athletic triumph. It was a symbolic reclaiming of Greek pride, connecting the reborn games to their ancient homeland. The 1896 Olympics were modest compared to the spectacle of later years. There were no elaborate opening ceremonies, no television broadcasts, no corporate sponsorships. Yet in their simplicity lay their charm. They were a beginning, the fragile but promising first step toward the vision Pierre de Coubertin had dreamed of. An international gathering bound by friendship and the pursuit of excellence. When the Games closed on April 15th, the atmosphere was one of celebration and cautious optimism. The experiment had worked. The ancient flame had been lit again, and though it flickered in its infancy, it held the potential to grow into something far greater. Chapter 7: Growth, Rivalries, and the Early 20th Century Games. The success of Athens 1896 had proven the Olympic concept viable, but the road ahead was far from smooth. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Games would grow, stumble, and adapt, shaped by the ambitions of nations, the personalities of athletes, and the world's shifting political landscape. The second modern Olympics, held in Paris in 1900, were a strange affair. They were part of the World's Fair, stretching over 5 months without a clear opening or closing ceremony. Many athletes didn't even realize they were competing in the Olympics, and events ranged from the traditional, like athletics and swimming, to the unusual, including live pigeon shooting and obstacle swimming. While the Games expanded in size, they lacked the focused identity of Athens, and some worried that the revival might already be losing its direction. St. Louis 1904, held alongside another World's Fair, faced similar issues. Distance and cost limited international participation, and the United States dominated the medal tally. Still, the Games saw innovations such as boxing and freestyle wrestling, as well as the controversial and grueling marathon run in sweltering heat on dusty roads. It wasn't until London 1908 that the Olympics began to assume a form more recognizable to modern audiences. For the first time, a purpose-built stadium hosted the events. and national teams marched in a formal opening ceremony, each carrying their country's flag. The Games also introduced standardized rules, a step toward the uniformity needed for true international competition. Rivalries emerged, not just between athletes, but between nations, eager to assert their strength on the world stage through sport. Stockholm 1912 brought further refinement. The Games were praised for their organization and for the introduction of electronic timing and the photo finish. New events, such as the modern pentathlon, inspired by the skills of a soldier, reflected both the athletic ideals and the military undertones of the era. These Olympics also saw the debut of Jim Thorpe, the American athlete who stunned the world by winning both the pentathlon and decathlon, prompting King Gustav V of Sweden to declare, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." But the shadow of global conflict loomed. The scheduled 1916 Games, awarded to Berlin, were cancelled due to the First World War. The Olympics, envisioned as a tool for peace, could not stand against the realities of total war. When the Games resumed in Antwerp in 1920, the scars of conflict were still fresh. The Olympic flag, with its 5 interlocking rings symbolizing unity among the continents, was raised for the first time. A quiet but hopeful statement that the ideals of Coubertin still mattered. The 1920s and 1930s brought a mix of triumph and tension. Paris 1924 was grander and better organized than its 1900 predecessor, introducing the first Olympic village for athletes. Amsterdam 1928 saw the debut of the Olympic flame, linking the modern games symbolically to their ancient inspiration. Los Angeles 1932, held during the Great Depression, proved that even in hard times, the Olympics could draw the world's attention, offering a spectacle of determination and resilience. Yet the politicization of the Games was becoming increasingly evident. Nowhere was this more apparent than Berlin 1936, staged by Nazi Germany as a propaganda tool. The grandeur of the stadiums and ceremonies was undeniable, but so was the political intent. Still, the narrative was not entirely under the host's control. African-American athlete Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals, shattering Hitler's vision of Aryan supremacy and becoming a global symbol of athletic excellence. By the eve of the Second World War, the Olympics had grown from a small gathering in Athens to a major international event, attracting thousands of athletes and millions of spectators. They had weathered organizational mishaps, financial challenges, and political storms. Yet each Games had added a new layer to the tradition. In the next chapter, we will see how the Olympics confronted one of their greatest tests, surviving the disruptions of global war and emerging into a rapidly changing post-war world, where the ideals of unity would be challenged and redefined on an even larger stage. Chapter 8: The Olympics, Amid War, Cancellations and Controversy. The 1936 Berlin Olympics had been a showpiece for both sport and propaganda, a carefully choreographed display designed to project the power and prestige of Nazi Germany. Stadiums gleamed, flags rippled, and the Games themselves were staged with precision that left much of the world in awe. But as the applause faded and the athletes returned home, the forces of nationalism, militarism, and deep-seated political rivalries continued to build beneath the surface. Less than 3 years later, the world stood on the brink of catastrophe. Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 unleashed a war that would engulf continents, redraw maps, and take tens of millions of lives. The Olympic ideal, that sport could unite nations in peaceful competition, seemed painfully small in the face of such global violence. The first casualty of the conflict, at least in Olympic terms, was the 1940 Summer Games. Originally awarded to Tokyo, they were meant to be a statement of Japan's modernization and its place among the world's leading nations. The decision to grant the Games to Tokyo had been historic. It marked the first time they would be held outside Europe or North America, and Japanese organizers envisioned an event that would blend ancient tradition with modern spectacle. But history had other plans. In July 1938, with Japan deeply embroiled in the Second Sino-Japanese War, the strain of conflict made hosting impossible. Reluctantly, Tokyo relinquished the Games, and the International Olympic Committee reassigned them to Helsinki, Finland. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps the Games could still serve as a symbol of peace in an increasingly fractured world. That hope died in September 1939. Germany's invasion of Poland triggered the Second World War, and by the time snow fell in that first winter of the conflict, it was clear that there would be no Olympics in 1940. The world's attention had shifted from fields and tracks to trenches and battlefields. The next scheduled Games, in 1944, were awarded to London. The symbolism was fitting. The city had hosted the Olympics before, in 1908, and was seen as a stalwart of resilience and internationalism. But the war was still raging, with bombings, rationing, and the massive mobilization of resources making any thought of hosting the Games unrealistic. The Olympics, which had survived and adapted through centuries of peace and crisis, were brought to a halt not for one Olympiad, but for two. For 12 long years, the stadiums fell silent. The 4-year rhythm that had been the heartbeat of the modern Games since 1896 was broken. Generations of athletes, many of whom had trained for years in the hope of Olympic glory, saw their dreams vanish. Some of these men and women would serve in the military. Some would become prisoners of war. Some would never return home at all. The gap left by these cancelled Games was more than a missing entry in the Olympic record books. It was a missing chapter in countless personal stories. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was left scarred in ways that were both visible and invisible. Cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and millions were displaced. Yet amid the rubble, there was a hunger for renewal, for traditions that could help knit humanity back together. The Olympic Games, dormant for more than a decade, were among those traditions. The task of reviving them fell, fittingly, to London. In 1948, just 3 years after the end of the war, the city hosted what became known as the Austerity Olympics. It was an apt name. Britain was still under rationing. Bomb sites were a common sight in the streets. and the national economy was stretched to its limits. There would be no grand new stadiums, no lavish accommodations for athletes. Competitors were housed in military barracks, schools and colleges. Meals were plain, and every resource was used sparingly. And yet, despite the frugality, the games were infused with something powerful, a sense of gratitude simply to be held at all. 59 nations participated, including a number making their Olympic debuts. Germany and Japan were not invited, their recent roles as aggressors keeping them in international isolation. The Soviet Union, though eligible, declined to participate. They would make their debut in 1952. The 1948 Games brought moments that stood as quiet triumphs over adversity. One of the most remarkable belonged to Fanny Blankers-Koen, a 30-year-old Dutch mother of two, who won 4 gold medals in track and field. In an era when women's athletic abilities were still underestimated, she became an icon, earning the nickname the Flying Housewife. Her success resonated far beyond the track, symbolizing resilience, versatility, and the breaking of societal expectations. There was also a symbolic return for nations devastated by the war. Athletes from countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Greece marched in the opening ceremony, their flags a testament to endurance in the face of immense hardship. Still, the Games of 1948 were not untouched by politics. The Cold War had already begun to cast its long shadow across international relations. Though the Olympics were conceived as a neutral space, they could not escape being a stage for ideological competition. The absence of the Soviet Union was telling, and when they did appear 4 years later, it would mark the start of one of the most intense rivalries in Olympic history. What the war years had shown was that the Games could be interrupted, even silenced, but not extinguished. They could survive political collapse, global conflict, and economic hardship. But they would also emerge changed, more aware of their vulnerability, and more entangled in the politics of the age. The cancelled Olympics of 1940 and 1944 remain rare gaps in the modern record, reminders that while the Olympic flame is a symbol of continuity, it is not immune to the winds of history. And yet, those same interruptions gave the Games a renewed sense of purpose in the post-war world. They were no longer just a celebration of sport. They were, in their own way, a declaration that humanity, even after its darkest hours, could still come together in peace. In the years to follow, the arenas of competition would be filled once more. But the cheers would carry with them an unspoken truth, that the Games could never be entirely separate from the world in which they existed. The Second World War had taught the Olympics a hard lesson. They were both a symbol of unity and a mirror of the times, reflecting the turbulence, hopes, and conflicts of the human story. The post-war period would bring new opportunities and challenges. Technology was about to transform the way the world experienced the Games, while geopolitical tensions would make them a proxy battlefield for the Cold War. The next chapter of the Olympics story would unfold in front of a global audience like never before. Chapter 9: The Television Era and the Global Olympic Boom. The London Games of 1948 had proven that the Olympic spirit could survive the devastation of war. But the post-war world was a different place. A place where technology, politics, and economics were reshaping every aspect of life. For the Olympics, these changes would usher in a new era, one of unprecedented visibility, expanding global participation, and, inevitably, new tensions. The most transformative force arrived not in the stadiums, but in the living rooms of the world, television. Before the 1950s, the Olympics were experienced directly only by those able to travel to the host city. For everyone else, the Games existed in the pages of newspapers, on radio broadcasts, or in newsreels shown weeks later in cinemas. That all began to change with the arrival of live television coverage. The 1948 London Games were televised locally in Britain, offering a glimpse of the possibilities. But it was the 1960 Rome Olympics that marked the true beginning of the modern media age for the Games. Rome was a perfect stage for the first extensively televised Olympics. Cameras captured not only the events themselves, but the backdrop, the ancient ruins, the Baroque fountains, the sunlit streets. For the first time, millions could watch history unfold in near real time. And among the moments that captured hearts around the globe was the barefoot marathon victory of Abebe Bikila. Bikila, representing Ethiopia, ran without shoes on the cobblestone streets of Rome, striding past the illuminated arches of the Colosseum and the obelisk of Theodosius. His victory made him the first black African Olympic champion, a milestone that resonated far beyond sport. It was a triumph for Ethiopia, for Africa, and for the newly independent nations emerging from the shadow of colonialism. Television transformed the Games into a shared global event. In the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, the first to be broadcast live via satellite, viewers in Europe and North America could watch events as they happened on the other side of the world. Tokyo, rebuilt from wartime destruction, used the Games to announce its return to the international stage. The city's sleek bullet trains, modern venues, and dazzling ceremonies signaled not only Japan's technological prowess, but the increasingly ambitious nature of Olympic hosting. As television audiences grew, so too did the cultural influence of the athletes themselves. Gymnast Olga Korbut's daring routines in Munich 1972 captivated viewers and made her an instant star. Swimmer Mark Spitz's 7 gold medals at the same Games became a defining feat of athletic dominance. Athletes were no longer just competitors. They were global icons, their images broadcast into homes from Moscow to Melbourne. Yet the television era also magnified the Olympics' vulnerabilities. The Munich Games, meant to celebrate peace and openness, became a stage for tragedy when members of the Israeli team were taken hostage and killed by the Palestinian group Black September. The attack was broadcast worldwide, its horror etched into the collective memory. For the first time, a global audience saw not only the triumphs of the Olympics, but also the way political violence could intrude upon them. The Cold War turned the Games into a symbolic battleground. The United States and the Soviet Union each used Olympic victories as proof of their ideological superiority. Medal counts were followed like political scoreboards, and state-supported training programs, especially in the Eastern Bloc, fueled debates about fairness and the true meaning of amateurism. But television also had a unifying effect. The Parade of Nations during opening ceremonies became a rare moment when countries from all political camps appeared together. Viewers saw faces and flags from parts of the world they might otherwise never encounter. As decolonization swept Africa and Asia, new nations made their Olympic debuts, proudly marching under their own banners. For these countries, the Games were not just about sport. They were about staking a claim to international recognition and equality. By the 1970s, broadcast rights had become a crucial source of revenue for the International Olympic Committee. Networks paid vast sums for the rights to air the Games, money that in turn funded the event's expansion. Ceremonies became more elaborate, venues more ambitious, and the scale of participation larger than ever. But this commercialization brought its own challenges. The need to satisfy sponsors and broadcasters sometimes clashed with the ideals of the Olympic movement. The 1968 Mexico City Games encapsulated the contradictions of the television era. They were the first games held in Latin America, featuring high-altitude drama and record-breaking performances, like Bob Beeman's long jump, which shattered the world record by an astonishing 55 centimeters. Yet they were also marked by political unrest. Just days before the opening ceremony, government forces killed scores of student protesters in what became known as the Tlatelolco massacre. And during the Games themselves, American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their gloved fists in a Black Power salute during the medal ceremony, a televised act of protest against racial injustice that sparked both condemnation and lasting admiration. The global reach of television meant that every Olympic moment, whether it was an extraordinary athletic feat, a personal triumph, or a political gesture, was amplified to millions. The Games were now inseparable from the broader cultural and political currents of their time. By the end of the 1970s, the Olympics had become one of the most watched events in the world. But they were also a more complicated spectacle, no longer simply a celebration of athletic excellence. They were a mirror, reflecting both the best and the most troubling aspects of the world beyond the stadium. And in the 1980s, that mirror would reflect a series of unprecedented challenges: boycotts, doping scandals, and the blurring line between amateurism and professionalism. The Games would grow larger and more profitable than ever. But they would also face questions about their integrity and their future. Chapter 10: Modern Challenges, Politics, Doping, and the Future of the Games. By the early 1980s, the Olympic Games had become the most watched recurring event in human history, a vast and carefully choreographed meeting of nations. The reach of television had turned athletes into global celebrities, and the Games themselves into symbols of national pride. Yet with this increased visibility came a greater vulnerability to the pressures of the world outside the stadium. Politics, performance-enhancing drugs, financial burdens, and debates over professionalism all began to push the Olympics into a new and more complicated era. The Moscow boycott of 1980. The decade began with a crisis. In December 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan, escalating tensions in a Cold War already running hot. US President Jimmy Carter responded by calling for a boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics, set to be held in Moscow. His appeal was framed as a moral stance, a refusal to participate in what he saw as a propaganda showcase for a nation engaged in aggression. Ultimately, more than 60 nations joined the boycott, including Japan, West Germany, and Canada. Some countries allowed their athletes to compete under the Olympic flag rather than their national banners, but many stayed away entirely. The absence was glaring. Entire events lacked their top contenders. In swimming, the absence of powerhouse teams like the United States left medals to be contested among smaller fields. Track and field events were similarly depleted. For the athletes caught in the middle, the boycott was devastating. Training cycles are built around the 4-year rhythm of the Games, and for many, 1980 represented their one and only chance to compete at the Olympic level. The decision was not theirs to make. Politics had overruled performance. Many would never return to that level again. From the Soviet perspective, the Games were still a success, though the medal table told an unsurprising story. The USSR dominated, followed by East Germany, both reaping the benefits of the absence of key rivals. But the sense of Olympic unity, already fragile, had been fractured. The Los Angeles boycott of 1984. The tit-for-tat continued 4 years later. In 1984, the Summer Olympics returned to the United States for the first time since 1932, with Los Angeles as the host city. By then, memories of the Moscow boycott were still fresh, and many suspected retaliation was inevitable. In May 1984, the Soviet Union announced it would not send a team, citing security concerns and accusing the United States of chauvinism and anti-Soviet sentiment. 13 other Eastern Bloc countries, including East Germany and Cuba, joined the boycott. In reality, the decision was as political as the US boycott had been, a Cold War mirror image. The absence of the Eastern Bloc nations altered the competitive landscape, especially in sports, where they had traditionally excelled. American athletes swept events that in other years might have been more fiercely contested. The US topped the medal table with 174 medals, a record total that owed as much to the absence of rivals as to the performances themselves. Yet despite the boycott, the Los Angeles Games were notable for their financial success. Unlike the debt-ridden Montreal Games of 1976, Los Angeles relied heavily on corporate sponsorships, existing facilities, and private investment. The model was so successful it produced a surplus, proving that the Olympics could be profitable if managed differently, though it also set the stage for future debates about commercialization and the influence of corporate sponsors on the Games, the doping era. While politics dominated the headlines in the early 1980s, another issue was simmering, one that would grow into one of the Olympics' most persistent challenges: doping. Performance-enhancing drugs were not new to sport, but in the Cold War era, state-sponsored doping programs took them to a level the world had never seen. East Germany's system was the most infamous, with athletes, often without informed consent, subjected to systematic steroid use from a young age. The program produced extraordinary results. East German swimmers, for example, dominated the pool in the 1970s and 1980s, their medal tallies dwarfing those of much larger nations. For years, suspicions circulated, but concrete evidence was scarce. Then came the 1988 Seoul Olympics and the men's 100-meter final, one of the most anticipated races in history. Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson powered across the finish line in a world record 9.79 seconds, defeating American rival Carl Lewis. The victory was short-lived. Within 72 hours, Johnson tested positive for the steroid stanozolol and was stripped of his medal. The incident shocked the public and confirmed what many insiders had long feared. The problem was not confined to whispers and rumors. The International Olympic Committee, IOC, was forced to confront the reality that doping was a systemic threat to the credibility of the Games. In the years that followed, anti-doping measures became stricter with the establishment of the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, in 1999. Though the battle remains ongoing. The end of amateurism. From its inception, the modern Olympics had been built on the ideal of amateur competition. Pierre de Coubertin believed that the Games should be a celebration of sport for its own sake, untainted by professional contracts and financial incentives. But by the late 20th century, the line between amateur and professional was becoming impossible to police. Eastern Bloc athletes, for example, were officially amateurs, but in reality were full-time, state-supported competitors whose training and resources rivaled any professional program. Meanwhile, Western athletes often had to juggle training with jobs or seek under-the-table sponsorships to survive. By the 1980s, the hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore. The IOC began to relax its rules, and in 1992, professionals were allowed in basketball, paving the way for the US Dream Team at the Barcelona Games. Led by Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird, the team dominated the tournament and drew massive global attention. Critics argued it was unfair. Supporters saw it as inevitable and a major boost to the game's popularity. The shift opened the door for professionals in many sports, raising the overall standard of competition, but also tilting the playing field toward wealthy nations that could support elite athlete development, hosting costs, and public backlash. While the 1984 Los Angeles Games had proven that the Olympics could be profitable, they were the exception rather than the rule. Hosting the Games became an increasingly expensive undertaking, often leaving cities with massive debts and underused facilities. The 1976 Montreal Games had already been a cautionary tale, saddling the city with debt that took decades to repay. In the 21st century, the problem only grew. The scale of Olympic venues, infrastructure, and security demands pushed costs into the tens of billions. Cities like Boston, Hamburg, and Rome withdrew bids for future games after public opposition, citing financial concerns. The IOC was forced to rethink its bidding process, offering more flexibility and encouraging the use of existing facilities, moments that transcended the challenges. Despite the boycotts, scandals, and financial debates, the Olympics continue to produce moments that reminded the world why they mattered. In 1992, South Africa returned to the Games after decades of apartheid-era exclusion, sending a multiracial team that included runner Alana Meyer and long-distance star Zola Budd. Their presence was a sign of political transformation. The same year, in Barcelona, British rower Sir Steve Redgrave began his extraordinary run of 5 consecutive Olympic golds, a career that would span 2 decades and 5 games. In Sydney 2000, Cathy Freeman, an Aboriginal Australian, lit the Olympic cauldron during the opening ceremony, a symbolic acknowledgement of her people's place in the nation's story. Days later, she won gold in the 400 metres, draped in both the Australian and Aboriginal flags. And in Rio 2016, the IOC introduced the Refugee Olympic team, composed of athletes who had fled conflict and persecution. Their participation was a reminder that the Games could still serve as a platform for hope, unity, and human dignity. The road ahead. As the Games moved into the 21st century, the challenges of the modern era became clearer. Doping scandals continued to surface, most notably involving Russian athletes in the lead-up to the 2016 and 2018 Games, resulting in bans and stripped medals. The role of politics remained unavoidable, from disputes over flags and national anthems to debates about human rights in host nations. At the same time, the push for gender equality reshaped the program, with near parity in the number of events for men and women by the Tokyo 2020 Games. New sports like skateboarding, surfing, and sport climbing were added to appeal to younger audiences. The future of the Olympics will likely hinge on how they navigate these intersecting pressures, staying relevant to new generations, ensuring fairness in competition, and finding sustainable hosting models that don't burden cities with decades of debt. And yet, for all the problems, the central magic of the Games endures. Every 4 years, the world pauses, if only for a few weeks, to watch people push the boundaries of human ability. Nations set aside, if not forget, their conflicts to march together in a single parade. The Olympic flame, lit in ancient Olympia and carried across continents, remains a symbol that even in a fractured world, there is still something we can share. The Olympics have weathered war, politics, scandal, and change. They have been shaped by, and have shaped, the modern world. And as long as athletes are willing to train for years, for a moment measured in seconds, as long as crowds are willing to cheer for strangers wearing another country's colours, the spirit of Olympia will live on. Imperfect, but enduring.